right, welcome back to American Literature 2. Today we're going to focus on The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Before we get started, I want everybody to take out their guided notes that you took while you were reading. They should be completely finished. And we're going to use those guided notes to kind of help with our discussion and our activity that I have planned for us today. So I also want to remind you that your discussion board is due on Friday at 11:59 p.m. So if you haven't started looking at those, you need to go ahead and start looking at those on Canvas and be prepared to submit those after our last class. All right, so at this time, I would like to ask that you bring up and write down the questions that you had on the whiteboard. So I talked about this last class period, and what I need you to do is to look at the bottom of your guided note sheet where it asks you what kind of question did you have about the story. And I want you to write your question on the board. So go ahead and take a few minutes and do that. I'm going to use those questions to kind of help us with our discussion of the story in class today. All right, so after, now that you've all finished that, let's go over what we're going to do in our class activity for this particular story. So first, we're going to look at the discussion questions, and I went ahead and marked through the ones who were similar to others. And I got us 5 good questions that we're going to use to kind of fuel our discussion about the story today. And then after that, we're going to watch the crash course video from John Green, and you're familiar with the John Green videos. We've watched several of them so far, and this is going to kind of give us some background information on the author, on the story, and on the time period. And so this video is 13 minutes long, and it will be a good background for our discussion. And then after that, we're going to review some information about the author. We're going to talk about that. And then we are going to look at 4 themes that were found in this story. And from those 4 themes, we're going to break out into our discussion groups, which you already know who your partners are because we've had the same discussion group every time. And with that group, you're going to analyze one particular theme and find some textual evidence. And we will do an activity with all of that at the end. All right, so the 5 discussion questions that we're going to be using to kind of fuel our discussion today is, what is the rescuer? What is symbolic about the woman in the wallpaper? Who does she represent? Why is she important? Is there anything significant about the wallpaper being the color yellow? And we're going to talk about the emotions that the color yellow can bring out in people. And what were women's rights like during this time? We're going to talk about the time period. We're going to talk about the societal expectations of women. And is this story based on real events? And we're going to get into all of that when we get into the background of the author. So we're first going to start by watching the crash course video.
Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course Literature. So for the last few weeks, we've been talking a lot about dystopias, imaginary societies gone wrong. Like George Orwell's 1984 is a world of war, surveillance, and mind control. The Handmaid's Tale portrays a toxic landscape in which healthy women are forced to produce offspring for the ruling class. Candide showed us the best of all possible worlds, which was terrible. And Parable of the Sower takes place in an alternate universe where a sloganeering strongman president presides over a country experiencing intense social disorder thanks to climate change. Fortunately, none of that stuff has happened yet. But today we're going to talk about our final dystopia of the series, The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and it's about a dystopia that already happened. First published in 1892 in the New England Magazine, this story is less of a what-if dystopia than a this is happening to me call to action. So at first glance, the life that Gilman describes in this story might not seem that bad. A young woman is married to a doctor and spends all of her time in a country mansion, and I mean all of her time. But make no mistake about it, the social order in this story is in some ways as oppressive as the others that we've examined. Gilman's narrator is imprisoned within her marriage and her social order and also her house. And she eventually goes insane trying to preserve her perspective. Today I want to talk about Gilman, who was a feminist, humanist, sociologist, novelist, poet, and essay.
All right, so in the whole class, we would watch the whole video, but for the sake of this presentation, we're going to pause it here. All right, so I would ask my students, John Green talks about the story being a dystopian novel. And so I want us to discuss, how is What is the genre of dystopian? What does it take to fit into the genre? And how does the Yellow Wallpaper possibly fit into that genre? We're going to talk about, did we think that it was a dystopian when we read it? And what kind of characteristics could make it a dystopian? And we would take a few minutes and do that.
Hi, I'm John Green.
All right, so let's get into the background information of Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So Charlotte Perkins Gilman was born in 1860, and shortly after she was born, her father left them and moved to San Francisco. And so her mother often withheld affection from Gilman and her brother, and she just wanted to protect them from being emotionally invested and being emotionally vulnerable, because obviously Gilman's mother's relationship did not work out, and so she is probably likely trying to shelter her children from experiencing the same kind of pain that she felt. But unfortunately, Gilman describes her childhood as being painful and lonely. So prior to getting married, Gilman was able to support herself through different careers, and she married to Charles Stetson in 1884. And Charles Stetson was an artist himself. So during the years before her marriage, Gilman became aware of the social injustices that women of her time period were facing. And so she began her writing career by writing poems on women's rights. And so even though she was afraid of having to try to balance motherly and wifely duties, she got married. And then 11 months after being married, they had their daughter, Catherine. And so 11 months after being married, having a child is moving things pretty quickly. And so Gilman sank into an even deeper depression, and is likely because she is trying to balance her individuality with her motherly and wifely duties, which made it really difficult for her. And so, to help her out, her husband and her mother decided to take her to a doctor named Dr. Mitchell, who was a famous American neurologist. And so, Dr. Mitchell is the one who created the idea of the rest cure. And he prescribed this to her. And the rest cure essentially is given to women who were suffering from hysterics, which is often just women who are anxious or depressed, or just emotionally different than society's expectations for what a woman should be like. And so the rest cure requires that women be on complete bed rest, complete isolation for several weeks, with limited to no intellectual activity, no interactions with others, no stimuli of any sort. So no reading, no writing, no talking, no doing anything. And so the rest is supposed to help. But Gilman says that the rest actually forced her to reach the edge of madness, the edge of insanity, which actually inspired her to write The Yellow Wallpaper. And so there's a connection between the narrator of The Yellow Wallpaper and Gilman herself. So in 1888, she felt that her marriage was threatening her sanity, so she took her daughter and they moved to Pasadena, California, and she later got divorced from her husband in 1894. And then later on, she sent her daughter back to live with her husband and his new wife. And she published Women in Economics, which became a popular, famous feminist manifesto. And Gilman's final act of taking control over her own life was in 1935 when she was diagnosed with cancer, and she decided her own fate and she committed suicide. So as a class, we're going to look at 4 different themes, and if you look on your guided note sheet, you should see the 4 themes listed on your sheet: mental illness, gender roles, outer versus inner, and self-expression. So in your groups of about 3 or 4, you are going to be assigned one of these themes, and you're going to find 5 pieces of textual evidence to support this theme. And so once you have your 5 pieces of textual evidence, you're going to write it on this document and type your textual evidence on here, and we will use this as a class to discuss the themes and how they are represented in this particular story. So you have about 10 minutes to find your 5 pieces of textual evidence and type your textual evidence in the collaborative Google Doc.